After my husband's affair with my best friend and losing everything, my job, my home, even my sense of worth, he said I'd never rise again. Living out of a rundown motel, I found a dusty suitcase with my name on it. Inside was $70,000 cash, a flight ticket, and a note. "This is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address." When I arrived, what I saw changed everything. 7 months ago I had a marriage, a job, and a best friend I trusted with my life. Now I was living in a motel room that charged by the week, eating meals that cost less than $2, and trying to figure out how to survive on freelance work that barely covered rent. My husband Justin had been sleeping with my best friend Natalie for who knows how long. When I caught them, everything fell apart so fast it felt coordinated. I lost my job within 2 weeks. The divorce left me with almost nothing. Friends stopped returning my calls. I went from middle-class stability to rock bottom in less than 2 months. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and sharing this journey with me. If you believe that truth and resilience matter, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps these stories reach others who need hope. Now let's see what happened next. I was sitting on the edge of a bed that squeaked every time I moved, eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, when I noticed the suitcase under the bed. Old brown leather with brass corners and a luggage tag with my full name in handwriting I knew belonged to my Aunt Helen. She'd died 9 months earlier, the eccentric family member everyone described as difficult and paranoid. I pulled out the suitcase, found the key taped to the bottom, and opened it to discover $70,000 in cash and a note that rewrote everything I thought I knew about my life. The note warned me not to trust Justin or Natalie, told me they'd been planning my destruction since before my wedding, and said that my mother's death 6 years ago wasn't an accident. It directed me to an address in Portland where the real fortune was waiting, and it ended with instructions to finish what my mother had started before they silenced her. Helen had spent her final years collecting evidence while everyone called her crazy. Now she was offering me a choice: take the money and disappear, or use it to fight back against the people who'd destroyed everything. I'm Samantha Garrett, and before everything collapsed, my life looked normal enough that I never questioned it. I had a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood where people still knew each other's names. Mrs. Chin down the hall always smiled when she saw me. The maintenance guy actually showed up when something broke. The apartment wasn't fancy. The walls were thin enough that I could hear our neighbors watching television at night, and the carpet had stains from previous tenants that wouldn't come out no matter how much I scrubbed. But Justin and I had painted the living room together, spent an entire Saturday assembling furniture from flat-pack boxes, and hung wedding photos on the wall where afternoon light made everything look warmer than it actually was. I worked as a marketing coordinator at Brennan & Associates, a mid-sized firm downtown that handled campaigns for local businesses. Small stuff mostly. Social media strategies for family restaurants. Website redesigns for dental offices. Email marketing for boutique shops that could barely afford our services. It wasn't the career I'd imagined when I graduated college with dreams of working for major brands, but it paid $48,000 a year plus benefits. That was enough to cover my half of rent and groceries, with a little left over for the occasional dinner out when Justin and I wanted to pretend we had more disposable income than we actually did. My boss Marcus Brennan was professional but distant. The kind of supervisor who complimented your work in meetings but never quite promoted you. He remembered to ask about your weekend but never actually listened to the answer. I'd been there 4 years, consistently receiving performance reviews that praised my reliability while somehow never translating into raises or advancement. But I didn't question it. I showed up every morning at 8:30, made coffee in the break room using the machine that always sputtered, sat at my desk with its view of the parking lot and did my job. It felt stable. Predictable. Safe. Justin worked as a business consultant, or that's what he told me. His schedule was irregular in ways that seemed normal for someone in his field. Late nights finishing proposals. Weekend trips to meet startup founders in Seattle or San Francisco. Conference calls at odd hours with East Coast clients. He'd come home exhausted, kiss my forehead, heat up whatever leftovers were in the fridge and fall asleep on the couch with his laptop still open. I'd cover him with a blanket and feel this strange mixture of affection and loneliness, proud that he worked so hard while resenting how little time we actually spent together. We'd met 7 years ago at a dinner party thrown by mutual friends, or at least that's what I'd always believed. Justin had been charming that night. He asked questions about my work and actually listened to the answers. He made jokes that were clever without being mean. He offered to help clean up after dinner when everyone else had moved to the living room. He asked for my number at the end of the evening, and I gave it to him while trying not to appear too eager. Our courtship felt natural and easy, like we'd been designed to fit together. Dinners at casual restaurants. Walks through the city. Lazy Sunday mornings reading newspapers in bed. He proposed after 18 months, getting down on one knee in the same park where we'd had our third date. I said yes without hesitation because I couldn't imagine a reason to say no. But things had changed over the past 2 years. Subtle shifts that I noticed but convinced myself were normal. Justin became more protective of his phone, tilting the screen away when I walked past, taking calls in the other room, setting it face down on the table during dinner. He was vaguer about his work projects, offering broad descriptions instead of the detailed stories he used to share. He picked fights over small things. The way I loaded the dishwasher. Whether we needed organic vegetables or regular ones. How much time I spent talking to Natalie. Natalie had been my best friend since college, back when we were both broke students splitting packages of ramen and talking about the futures we'd build someday. She'd been my maid of honor, standing next to me in a bridesmaid dress we'd picked out together, crying during the ceremony in a way that made me cry too. She helped us move into our apartment, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs and making jokes about how much stuff we'd accumulated. Every Thursday night for the past 5 years she came over with a bottle of wine, and we'd sit on my couch talking about everything. Work frustrations. Her latest dating disasters. My concerns about whether Justin and I were drifting apart. She listened with what seemed like genuine sympathy, nodding in all the right places, saying things like all marriages go through phases and you two just need to reconnect. She told me how lucky I was to have found someone like Justin, how most men weren't as supportive or steady, how I shouldn't take for granted what I had. I believed her because questioning your best friend feels like questioning reality itself. If you can't trust the person who's been beside you through every major life event for over a decade, then who can you trust? My mother Catherine had died 6 years earlier in a car accident on a rainy night. Her vehicle wrapped around a tree on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. The police said she'd been going too fast, possibly fell asleep at the wheel. My Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister, insisted something was wrong with the official story. But everyone dismissed her concerns as grief talking. Helen had always been the difficult one. The family member who showed up to gatherings with pamphlets about corporate corruption and warnings about trusting the wrong people. When she died 9 months ago, alone in her house surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers, I felt guilty for not visiting more. For not taking her seriously. For writing her off as paranoid when maybe she'd just seen patterns the rest of us were too comfortable to notice. I went to work every day. Paid my bills on time. Kept the apartment clean. Tried to be a good wife. Did everything right according to the unwritten rules of middle-class respectability. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, trusted the right people and played by the rules, I'd be protected from the kind of chaos you read about happening to other people. I thought that doing everything right mattered. That loyalty meant something. That the life I'd built was real and solid and mine. Looking back now from this motel room with its cigarette-stained walls and bed that squeaks with every movement, I can see how naive that was. How carefully constructed my entire life had been by people who saw me as useful rather than human. How every relationship I'd trusted had been performance art designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. The apartment, the job, the marriage, the friendship. All of it built on foundations that were never real to begin with. But I didn't know that yet. Not sitting in my normal life 7 months ago, believing in the stability of routine and the protection of playing by rules that turned out to be written by people who had no intention of following them. I didn't know that Justin and Natalie had been planning my destruction since before my wedding. I didn't know that my mother's death wasn't an accident. I didn't know that Aunt Helen had spent her final years collecting evidence while everyone dismissed her as crazy. I didn't know any of it until I found that suitcase with $70,000 and a note that offered me a choice between disappearing and fighting back. And by then I'd already lost everything I thought mattered. The suitcase sat on the motel bed next to me, $70,000 in cash spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Helen's note was still clutched in my hand, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. I read it again, trying to make sense of words that rewrote my entire history. They'd been planning this since before my wedding. My mother's death wasn't an accident. Finish what she started before they silenced her. I needed to understand how I'd missed it. How I'd lived inside a lie for 7 years without seeing the truth. So I let myself remember that Tuesday 6 months ago when my comfortable illusions finally shattered beyond repair. I'd woken up that morning feeling sick to my stomach. Not the kind of nausea that comes from bad food or the flu, but something deeper. A wrongness that sat in my chest and made it hard to breathe properly. I tried to ignore it, going through my normal routine. Shower. Coffee. Toast that I couldn't finish. Getting dressed for work while Justin slept in because he'd said he had a late meeting the night before and needed to rest. By 10 o'clock that morning, I was sitting at my desk at Brennan and Associates, staring at a social media calendar for a dental office, and I couldn't focus. My hands felt cold. My heart kept racing for no reason I could name. The nausea got worse instead of better, and finally I walked into Marcus's office and told him I needed to go home. I expected him to make it difficult. Marcus wasn't the kind of boss who appreciated people leaving in the middle of the day, even when they were legitimately sick. But he just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said "feel better" in a tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Like he already knew something I didn't. Like he was relieved I was leaving. The drive home took 20 minutes through midday traffic. I kept the radio off because noise felt like too much to handle. My hands shook slightly on the steering wheel. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I probably just had a stomach bug and anxiety was making it worse. But the dread kept growing with every block I drove, this certainty that something was wrong even though I had no logical reason to feel that way. When I pulled into the parking lot of our apartment building, I saw Natalie's car in a visitor spot. A silver Honda Civic that I'd been in hundreds of times. She had a key to our apartment and sometimes stopped by during the day if her internet was acting up and she needed reliable Wi-Fi for work. It shouldn't have been strange to see her car there. But on a Tuesday afternoon when Justin was supposed to be at the office and Natalie was supposed to be working from her own apartment, something about it felt wrong. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine still running, trying to talk myself out of the feeling in my gut. They were probably working on something together. Maybe planning a surprise for me. Maybe Justin had come home sick too and Natalie had stopped by to check on him. I cycled through a dozen innocent explanations, each one more desperate than the last. I finally turned off the engine and walked across the parking lot to our building. Up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again. Down the hallway with its worn carpet and flickering overhead light. I put my key in the lock as quietly as possible, though I couldn't have said why stealth felt necessary. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside. Not the empty kind of quiet, but the occupied kind where you can sense people are home even when you can't hear them. I stood in the living room, my work bag still over my shoulder, listening. That's when I heard the laughter coming from our bedroom. Natalie's laughter. Not her normal laugh, the one she used when we were watching comedies on the couch or when I said something genuinely funny. This was different. Lower. More intimate. The kind of laugh that's meant for someone specific, designed to make that person feel special and desired. I'd heard her use it before, years ago when she was dating someone she really liked, back in college when we'd all been young and everything had felt less complicated. I stood frozen in my own living room, staring at the closed bedroom door, while my brain worked overtime to construct explanations that would let me keep believing in the life I thought I had. Maybe she was on the phone with someone. Maybe Justin wasn't even home and she was watching something on her laptop. Maybe I was misunderstanding the situation because I already felt sick and paranoid. But I knew. Somewhere beneath all the desperate rationalizations, I already knew what I was going to find when I opened that door. I crossed the living room, each step feeling like it took an hour. I didn't knock. Why would I knock on my own bedroom door in my own apartment? I just turned the handle and pushed it open. Justin and Natalie were in my bed. Tangled in the gray sheets I'd washed 3 days earlier. Looking at each other with the kind of intimacy that doesn't develop in an afternoon or even a week. This was familiar territory for them. Comfortable. Routine. When they saw me standing in the doorway, the first emotion on Natalie's face wasn't shame or guilt. It was annoyance. Like I was the one interrupting something important rather than discovering that my husband and my best friend had been systematically betraying me. She didn't scramble to cover herself. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me with this expression that said, "Why are you making this dramatic when you should have seen this coming?" Justin got out of bed and pulled on his jeans with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me this wasn't the first time he'd had to get dressed quickly in an awkward situation. That realization landed harder than the initial shock of finding them together. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was routine for them. Practiced. Something they'd done enough times that the mechanics of it had become smooth and automatic. He looked at me with an expression that was somehow worse than guilt would have been. It was impatience mixed with relief, like this confrontation was an inconvenience but also something he'd been waiting for because pretending had gotten tiresome. "Sam," he said in that calm voice he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "We need to talk about this like adults. This isn't what it looks like." The absurdity of that statement almost made me laugh. It was exactly what it looked like. But he stood there in our bedroom in the middle of being caught in the most obvious betrayal possible, and tried to gaslight me into questioning my own eyes. Like I was the one creating a problem by refusing to accept his reframing of reality. Natalie sat up, holding the sheet around herself with a modesty that would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. She had the nerve to look at me with something close to pity. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said, "like there was a good way to discover your husband and best friend were having an affair. But honestly, Sam, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The presumption in that statement stole my breath. Not just that she'd been sleeping with Justin, but that she thought I should have known. That this was somehow predictable or even my fault for not noticing sooner. That their betrayal was justified because my marriage had problems I'd been too stupid or blind to recognize. I asked the question I knew I'd regret asking. "How long?" My voice sounded strange to me. Too calm. Too detached. Like I was asking about something that didn't matter rather than the destruction of my entire life. Justin answered in the same emotionless tone, like he was discussing a business arrangement that had run its course. "Does it matter? Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest." That word. Pretending. It cut through me worse than any of the rest of it. How long had he been pretending to love me? How long had every kiss goodbye been performance? How long had every "I love you" been a lie? And how long had Natalie been sitting on my couch every Thursday night, drinking my wine, listening to me talk about my marriage problems, offering advice designed to keep me complacent while she was sleeping with my husband the rest of the week? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things or make a scene. I just turned around, walked back into the living room and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag I pulled from the hall closet. My laptop. Chargers. Toiletries. The practical things you need to survive when your life implodes. Justin followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have the adult conversation he'd mentioned. Still acting like this was a reasonable situation that could be resolved through calm discussion and mature communication. I left without saying another word. Walked out of the apartment I'd helped pay for, drove to a coffee shop parking lot 3 miles away, and sat in my car crying until I couldn't breathe properly. Then I called my cousin Emma and asked if I could sleep on her couch for a few days while I figured out what to do next. That was 6 months ago. And now, sitting in this motel room with Helen's note and $70,000 in cash, I understood that Tuesday had been even worse than I'd thought. The betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been calculated, planned. Part of something bigger that connected to my mother's death and whatever Helen had spent her final years investigating. They'd been playing a long game with my life as the board. And I'd been too trusting, too naive, too desperate to believe in the stability of normal life to see what was happening until it was too late. I'd been living on Emma's couch for 5 days when I got the call from Marcus. My cousin had been kind enough to let me stay in her guest room after I'd left the apartment, and I'd been trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy by going to work every day like nothing had changed. Pretending that sleeping in someone else's house with all my possessions in a duffel bag was just a temporary inconvenience rather than a sign that my life was collapsing. Marcus asked me to come to his office first thing Monday morning. His voice on the phone had that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news and want to seem compassionate about it. I told myself it was probably about a new client project or maybe a performance review that had been scheduled months ago. I didn't let myself think about the alternative. I showed up at 8:15, wearing clothes I'd ironed using Emma's board because I wanted to look professional and put together even though I felt like I was barely holding myself intact. Marcus's office door was open, and he waved me in with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been satisfaction hidden behind a professional mask. "Samantha," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I need to talk to you about some changes happening in the department." I sat down, my hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my face neutral. Marcus shuffled some papers on his desk, not quite meeting my eyes, and I felt my stomach drop before he even started speaking. "We're restructuring the marketing department due to budget constraints," he said, using that careful corporate language that's designed to sound official and impersonal. "Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. We're offering a severance package that should help with the transition." He slid a folder across his desk toward me. I didn't touch it. I just stared at him, trying to process what he was saying while my brain screamed that this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when everything else was already falling apart. "Budget constraints," I repeated, hearing my own voice sound distant and hollow. "We just signed 3 new clients last month. I've seen the quarterly reports. We're not struggling financially." Marcus's expression didn't change. "These decisions are made at levels above my control, Samantha. I'm sorry, but the decision is final." I wanted to ask if this had anything to do with Justin. If maybe Marcus had heard about the separation and decided I was too much of a liability or a distraction. But something in his face stopped me. A flicker of discomfort that suggested asking questions wouldn't change anything and would only make this more awkward for both of us. I took the folder, left his office, and packed up my desk in 20 minutes. Nobody made eye contact with me. My co-workers suddenly became very interested in their computer screens or found urgent reasons to be in meetings. By 9 o'clock that morning, I was walking out of Brennan and Associates with a cardboard box containing 4 years of my professional life and a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Later, much later, I'd discover that Marcus and Justin had been college roommates. That their connection had always been part of the architecture of my life without my knowledge. That my job had never been as secure as I'd believed. That it had always been conditional on remaining useful to people whose agendas I didn't understand. But sitting in my car in the parking lot that morning, I just felt the ground shift beneath me again. Another support kicked out while I was still trying to regain balance from the first blow. The divorce proceedings started 2 weeks after I lost my job. Justin hired Elizabeth Hartley, an attorney with a reputation for winning cases through procedural aggression and strategic cruelty. My attorney was court-appointed, a tired man named Gerald Stokes who seemed to have given up on believing in justice somewhere during the previous decade and was just going through the motions until retirement. Elizabeth filed motions that painted me as unstable, irresponsible, potentially dangerous. She used the fact that I'd lost my job as evidence of my inability to function as an adult. She pointed to my temporary housing situation, the fact that I was sleeping on my cousin's couch, as proof that I couldn't manage my own life. Every detail of my current circumstances became ammunition in a legal strategy designed to justify why Justin deserved to keep everything while I deserved nothing. The judge presiding over our case was Robert Cunningham, a man in his late 50s who had an efficient way of moving through his docket that suggested he'd already made his decisions before hearing any actual testimony. Every motion Elizabeth filed, Judge Cunningham approved. Every request Gerald made on my behalf, the judge denied with barely a glance at the supporting documentation. Justin kept our apartment because his name was listed first on the mortgage, even though I'd contributed equally to the down payment and monthly payments for 5 years. He kept our car because I'd missed 2 payments during the chaos following my job loss. He kept the furniture we'd bought together, the savings account we'd built together, the retirement funds I'd contributed to for years. The settlement left me with my clothing, my laptop, and barely enough money to cover 3 months of rent at any apartment I could actually afford. The worst part wasn't losing the material possessions or even the financial devastation. It was watching Natalie take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore a navy blue designer suit that I recognized immediately. We'd picked it out together 2 years earlier during a shopping trip where we'd spent an entire afternoon trying on clothes and laughing in dressing rooms. She'd asked my opinion on that exact suit, and I'd told her it made her look professional and confident. Now she was wearing it to testify against me in divorce court. She sat in the witness stand with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, and lied with the kind of conviction that comes from practice. She told Judge Cunningham that I'd been unstable for months. That I'd made concerning comments about self-harm that had worried her. That I'd become increasingly paranoid and difficult to be around. That Justin had stayed in the marriage out of obligation and fear rather than love. None of it was true. Not a single word. But Natalie delivered each lie with perfect emotional calibration, her voice breaking slightly at the right moments, her expression showing concern mixed with reluctance, like testifying against me was painful but necessary for my own good. Judge Cunningham listened with an expression of concern, nodding sympathetically, taking notes. When Gerald tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Justin, Elizabeth objected before he could even finish the question. The judge sustained it immediately, cutting off any line of inquiry that might establish when the affair had actually started or reveal that Natalie's testimony might be motivated by something other than concern for my well-being. I sat at the defendant's table watching my best friend of over a decade systematically destroy what was left of my credibility, and I understood that this had been coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce proceedings. All of it timed and executed with precision that went beyond coincidence. After the divorce finalized, Emma let me stay in her guest room for 3 weeks before her husband David started making pointed comments about how I needed to get my life together. He never said it directly to me, but I'd hear him talking to Emma in their bedroom at night, his voice carrying through the thin walls. She can't stay here indefinitely. You're not helping her by letting her avoid dealing with her situation. She needs to find her own place and start rebuilding instead of hiding here. Emma would defend me in a tired voice that suggested she was running out of arguments. He's going through a difficult time. She just needs a little more support until she gets back on her feet. But I could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. The exhaustion of dealing with someone else's crisis. I started looking for anywhere else to go before Emma had to ask me to leave, and we both had to pretend it wasn't uncomfortable. My former colleague Diane offered her couch for 10 days. Then she decided my presence was bringing negative energy into her space and she needed to focus on her own mental health. A friend from college said I could stay with her for a week, then remembered she had family visiting and needed the spare room. Another friend let me sleep on her couch for 5 days before her roommate complained about having a stranger in their apartment. Everyone was sympathetic right up until sympathy became inconvenient. Right up until supporting me required actual sustained sacrifice rather than just kind words and temporary gestures. Then suddenly they remembered prior commitments, family obligations, personal boundaries that meant I needed to become someone else's problem. I understood it on some level. Nobody wants to live with someone else's crisis indefinitely. Nobody wants their home to become a shelter for a friend who can't get her life together. But the speed with which people retracted their support taught me something about how conditional most relationships really are. How quickly compassion expires when it becomes uncomfortable. When I finally scraped together enough money from freelance social media work to pay for a weekly rate at the Crossroads Motel, it felt less like hitting rock bottom and more like finally finding ground that wouldn't shift beneath me. At least the motel didn't pretend to care. At least Rita at the front desk didn't offer false comfort or temporary sympathy that would evaporate when I became inconvenient. Room 14 became my address. My home. The place where I'd eventually find a suitcase containing $70,000 and a note that explained why my destruction had been so systematic and so complete. Room 14 at the Crossroads Motel became my address 3 days after the last friend stopped returning my calls. I'd scraped together $200 from freelance social media work for a local bakery and a pet grooming business, both of which paid in irregular installments that arrived weeks after I'd submitted invoices. The motel sat off Highway 52, the kind of place where the weekly rate was displayed more prominently than the nightly rate, and the sign out front had been missing letters for so long that nobody bothered to fix it anymore. The woman at the front desk had a name tag that said Rita and an expression that suggested she'd witnessed this exact scenario thousands of times before. Women alone with duffel bags and desperate eyes, paying weekly rates while pretending this was temporary. She didn't ask questions about why I was there or how long I planned to stay. She just took my cash, handed me a key attached to a green plastic tag with the number 14 embossed in fading gold numbers, and recited the rules in a flat voice that suggested she'd said these words so many times they'd lost all meaning. Weekly rate includes utilities. Checkout is 11 if you're leaving. No visitors after 10. Laundry room is around back, costs $3 a load. Vending machines take bills or coins. I thanked her and carried my duffel bag across the parking lot to a door that had been painted blue at some point in the distant past but had faded to a color that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. The key stuck in the lock, requiring me to jiggle it 3 times before the mechanism finally gave way and let me inside. The room smelled like decades of cigarette smoke layered underneath industrial cleaner, the 2 cents fighting a war neither side could win. The carpet was a brown pattern designed to hide stains, which meant it was probably hiding decades worth of them. The bed sagged in the middle like it had given up on supporting anything, including people's hopes. A small table sat next to the window with 2 mismatched chairs, and a television from the early 2000s sat on a dresser with drawers that didn't close properly. The bathroom was tiny with a shower stall that had seen better years and a mirror that made everything look slightly yellow. This was home now. This was what my life had been reduced to. A room that charged by the week in a motel where nobody asked questions because asking questions might require caring about the answers. I tried to establish some kind of routine to keep myself from completely falling apart. I woke up early, made instant coffee using the small coffee maker that came with the room, and spent mornings applying for jobs online. Marketing coordinator positions, social media manager roles, anything that seemed remotely related to my experience and qualifications. I sent out dozens of applications every week, customizing cover letters and updating my resume to match whatever the job posting seemed to value most. Nobody called back. Nobody even sent rejection emails. My applications disappeared into whatever digital void companies used to sort through hundreds of desperate candidates, and I heard nothing. In the afternoons, I'd work on whatever freelance projects I could find. Small businesses that needed someone to manage their Facebook page or write email newsletters or design graphics for promotions. The work paid poorly and arrived sporadically, but it was enough to cover my weekly motel rate with a little leftover for food. Dinner was usually instant ramen prepared in the microwave. Sometimes I'd splurge on a can of soup or a frozen meal from the convenience store 2 blocks away. I'd eat sitting on the edge of the bed, watching television shows I didn't care about just to have noise that wasn't the sound of my own thoughts. My neighbors were mostly invisible. There was a long-haul trucker named Dale who parked his rig in the far corner of the lot and nodded at me sometimes when our paths crossed, but we never spoke. A woman who worked night shifts at the hospital kept her curtains permanently closed and came and went at odd hours. A man in his 60s lived in the room next to mine and played country music at a volume just low enough that I couldn't complain but loud enough that I could hear it through the thin walls. I avoided looking at myself in the bathroom mirror because I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She had the same face I'd always had, but something fundamental had changed in her eyes. Something had broken and not healed right, leaving her looking hollow and defeated in a way that made me ashamed. This was my life now. This was what betrayal and systematic destruction looked like. A motel room that smelled like smoke and failure, meals that cost less than $2, and the crushing understanding that nobody was coming to save me because everyone who might have cared had already decided I was too much trouble. I'd been living in room 14 for 3 weeks when I noticed the suitcase under the bed. I only found it because I'd dropped my phone charger and it had rolled under the bed frame. I got down on my hands and knees to retrieve it, reaching into the dusty space between the bed and the floor, and my hand hit something solid. Something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled it out into the light. An old suitcase, battered brown leather with brass corners that had oxidized to a dull green. It looked like something from another era, the kind of luggage people used before everything became plastic and disposable. A luggage tag was attached to the handle with twine, and when I turned it over to read what was written there, my hands started shaking. Samantha Marie Garrett. My full name, written in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. The precise, careful script of my Aunt Helen. I sat on the floor holding the suitcase, trying to make sense of how it had gotten there. Helen had died 9 months ago. I'd attended her funeral, stood at her graveside, watched them lower her casket into the ground. She'd lived alone for decades, died alone in her house surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers, and everyone had said it was sad but not surprising given how she'd isolated herself with her conspiracy theories and paranoid warnings about trusting the wrong people. How had her suitcase ended up under my bed in a motel room I'd only been living in for 3 weeks? Had she somehow known I'd end up here? Had she left it with Rita at the front desk with instructions to put it in whatever room I ended up renting? The logistics of it seemed impossible, but the evidence was sitting right in front of me, my name written in Helen's unmistakable handwriting. The suitcase was locked with 2 brass latches that had small keyhole mechanisms. I turned it over, checking the sides and bottom, and found a small plastic bag taped underneath. Inside the bag was a key. Helen had always been paranoid, but she'd also been practical in ways that made sense only to her. She hid things in plain sight, left clues that required you to look carefully, trusted that the right person would find what she'd left behind. I peeled off the tape, removed the key from the plastic bag, and unlocked the suitcase with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Inside was money. $70,000 in cash, bundled with rubber bands, mostly $100 bills with some 50s mixed in. The bills smelled faintly of mothballs and old books, like they'd been stored somewhere for years before being packed into this suitcase. Underneath the money was a plain ticket, printed on paper that had started to yellow slightly at the edges. Portland, Oregon. Departure date 4 days from now. And underneath the ticket was a note, handwritten on yellow legal paper in Helen's distinctive script. Samantha, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. The truth is in Portland. Use it wisely. I read those words 3 times, each reading making them feel more impossible and more true at the same time. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They'd been planning this since before my wedding. My mother Catherine had died 6 years ago in what everyone said was a car accident. Late night on a rainy road. Her car wrapped around a tree on a route she'd driven hundreds of times. The police report said she'd been going too fast, possibly fell asleep at the wheel. A tragic accident, but nothing suspicious. Helen had insisted something was wrong. She'd stood at the funeral, pulled me aside during the reception, and told me in an urgent whisper that my mother had been investigating financial fraud at the pharmaceutical company where she worked. That her death was too convenient. That the timing didn't make sense. That I needed to be careful about who I trusted. I'd dismissed it as grief twisting into paranoia. Everyone had. Helen was always seeing conspiracies, always warning about corporate corruption, always handing out pamphlets about things nobody else believed were real problems. We'd all learned to nod politely and change the subject. Now I was sitting on the floor of a motel room holding $70,000 in cash and a note that said my aunt had been right about everything. I spent that night in room 14 staring at the money and the note, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except the choice Helen was forcing me to make. By morning I'd decided. I wasn't running. I was done being the person things happened to. I was done disappearing while the people who'd destroyed my life got to move forward without consequences. I packed my duffel bag with the few possessions that mattered. Some clothes. My laptop. The $70,000 bundled in a waterproof bag. I left a note for Rita at the front desk saying I'd paid through the week but wouldn't be returning, and she looked at me with an expression that might have been concern or might have been relief that her weekly tenant problem was solving itself. Good luck, she said, which could have meant anything. The flight to Portland left early on a Thursday morning from a regional airport 40 minutes away. I'd booked it using Helen's cash and spent the entire drive there trying not to think about what I was actually doing. Flying across the country to follow instructions from a dead aunt who everyone had called paranoid. Chasing a conspiracy theory that connected my husband's affair to my mother's death 6 years ago. Believing that the systematic destruction of my life was part of something bigger and more calculated than simple betrayal. When I said it like that, it sounded crazy. But Helen's note was in my bag and the money was real and the plane ticket had my name on it. Crazy or not, I was going. The airline was one of those budget carriers that charge extra for everything including the right to breathe, or at least that's how it felt when they tried to make me pay $15 to bring a duffel bag that weighed less than most toddlers. I paid because arguing wasn't worth the energy, then spent 3 hours wedged between a businessman in an expensive suit who monopolized both armrests like he'd paid extra for the privilege, and a college kid who watched videos on his phone without headphones like some kind of sociopath. I didn't sleep. The seats were designed by people who actively hated the human spine, but that wasn't really why I stayed awake. My mind wouldn't stop cycling through questions that had no easy answers. What had my mother discovered that made her dangerous enough to kill? How deep did Justin and Natalie's involvement actually go? Had any part of my relationship with Justin been real, or had it all been performance from the very beginning? Were there genuine moments mixed in with the lies? Or had every kiss and every declaration of love been calculated manipulation? The businessman next to me kept glancing at the duffel bag I held on my lap, probably wondering why I was clutching it like it contained something irreplaceable instead of storing it in the overhead compartment like a normal person. I wanted to tell him it contained $70,000 and possibly the key to understanding why my entire life had been systematically dismantled. But I just stared out the window at darkness punctuated by scattered lights below, cities and towns full of people whose lives probably made sense to them in ways mine no longer did. Portland greeted me with gray skies and rain that felt different from rain back home. Colder. Heavier. The kind of wet that seeps through clothing and settles into bones. I rented a car using some of Helen's cash and a credit card I'd been avoiding because it was probably close to maxed out. The rental agent barely looked at me, just processed the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd done this transaction 10,000 times and had stopped carrying around transaction number 50. The address Helen had written led me out of the city toward Lake Oswego, a suburb that felt quiet in a way that suggested money and privacy and neighbors who minded their own business. The GPS guided me through streets lined with mature trees and houses set back from the road, each property maintaining polite distance from its neighbors. Helen's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small ranch-style place that looked like it had been built in the 70s and hadn't been updated much since. The windows were dark. The lawn had grown wild, grass reaching heights that suggested nobody had mowed it in months. The driveway was cracked, weeds pushing through the pavement. It was the kind of property that screams someone died here and nobody knows what to do with it yet. I parked in the driveway and sat in the rental car for a full minute, engine running, trying to decide if I was actually brave enough to go through with this. Helen's note had given me an address and told me the truth was waiting here. But what if the truth was worse than the lies? What if whatever I found in that house made everything more complicated instead of providing the clarity I was desperately hoping for? I turned off the engine and got out before I could talk myself out of it. The front door was locked, but Helen had left a second key in the suitcase taped inside a small envelope marked house. I let myself in, stepping into air that smelled stale and undisturbed, the particular smell of a place where nobody had opened a window or cooked a meal or lived an actual life in months. The interior was exactly what I'd expected based on family descriptions of Helen's living situation. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves and piled on tables and lined up along the baseboards. Filing cabinets in the living room where most people would have put a couch. Papers organized in boxes with labels written in Helen's precise handwriting. The kitchen looked barely used, just a coffee maker and a microwave and a sink full of dishes that nobody had washed before she died. But the note had directed me to the shed behind the house, not the house itself. I walked through to the back door and stepped into an overgrown yard where grass and weeds had taken over what might have once been an attempt at a garden. The shed sat in the far corner, a structure maybe 10 feet by 12 feet with newer locks on the door than anything else on the property. That detail stood out immediately. Everything else looked old and neglected, but those locks were recent. Industrial. The kind of hardware you use when you're protecting something that matters. I used the third key Helen had left, this one marked shed, and the lock opened smoothly like it had been recently maintained. Inside, the shed was organized in a way that made the house look chaotic by comparison. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years spanning from the 1980s to last year. Boxes were stacked along another wall, indexed with the kind of precision you'd find in a professional archive. And in the back corner, partially hidden under a tarp and some strategically placed paint cans, there was a trapdoor set into the floor. I moved the paint cans and pulled back the tarp. The trapdoor had a handle and a lock, and when I tried the fourth key Helen had left, it opened to reveal a ladder descending into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed down into what turned out to be a crawl space that had been converted into a climate-controlled evidence room. The space was maybe 7 feet tall and 15 feet square, lit by battery-powered LED strips that flickered on when I reached the bottom of the ladder. The air was cool and dry, maintained by a dehumidifier that hummed quietly in the corner. Filing cabinets, more boxes, a table with a laptop and what looked like an old cassette player, and scattered throughout photographs and documents protected in clear plastic sleeves. Helen had spent years building this. A secret archive documenting something she believed was worth preserving even if everyone thought she was paranoid for doing it. I started with the photographs because they were right in front of me, arranged on the table like evidence in a trial. The first one I picked up made my hands start shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. My mother Catherine standing between Justin and Natalie at what was clearly some kind of conference. All three of them wearing name tags and business casual clothing, smiling at the camera like colleagues who knew each other well. The banner in the background said Meridian Pharmaceuticals Annual Research Summit. The date printed on the bottom of the photo was 8 years ago. 8 years. 2 full years before I'd supposedly met Justin by chance at a dinner party. 2 years before our relationship had started. I stared at that photograph, my brain trying to construct explanations that would let me hold on to any part of the narrative I'd believed about my own life. Maybe they'd met briefly at a conference and forgotten about it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the photo was mislabeled. But I knew better. This wasn't coincidence. Justin hadn't met me by accident. He'd been positioned in my life deliberately, cultivated as a relationship by people who needed access to my mother and saw me as the easiest entry point. I'd been a target before I'd been a girlfriend. A mark before I'd been a wife. And every moment of intimacy, every declaration of love, every promise about our future together had been performance art in service of something I was only now beginning to understand. I set down the photograph with shaking hands and reached for the cassette player. The cassette player was old, one of those portable models from the 1980s with built-in speakers and a handle for carrying. Next to it sat a stack of cassette tapes, each one labeled in Helen's handwriting with dates, names and brief descriptions. I picked up the first tape in the stack, labeled Justin Garrett and Richard Moss, March 2019, discussion of Catherine Vaughn investigation status. My mother's name written there in Helen's careful script made my chest tighten. I loaded the tape into the player, pressed play and heard static followed by voices that made my hands go cold. The first voice belonged to Justin. I'd heard that voice every day for 7 years, listened to it tell me he loved me, listened to it make promises about our future together. Now I was hearing it discuss my mother like she was a problem that needed solving. Catherine's getting too close, Justin said, his tone businesslike and completely devoid of emotion. She's made copies of the trial data and she's been meeting with someone at the FDA. I don't know who yet, but I'm working on finding out through Samantha. Second voice responded, older and more authoritative. That must be Richard Moss. We can't let this go public. The approvals we've secured are worth billions. And if she exposes the data manipulation, we're looking at criminal charges and the end of the company. Can you contain her through the daughter? I've tried, Justin said. But Catherine doesn't discuss work details with Samantha. She's protective. Thinks she's keeping her daughter safe by not involving her in whatever she's investigating. It's actually making my job harder because Samantha doesn't know anything useful. Then we need to consider other options, Richard said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. More permanent solutions. We can't risk everything because one accountant developed a conscience. I paused the tape because I couldn't breathe properly. They were discussing killing my mother. Planning it like it was a business decision, weighing options and considering strategies. And Justin, the man I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, was part of that conversation. He'd been using me to try to gather information about what my mother knew, and when that didn't work, he'd participated in planning her murder. I forced myself to press play again. There are ways to make it look accidental, Richard continued. We have people who specialize in this kind of problem. Car accidents happen all the time, especially on rainy nights on dangerous roads. Nobody questions those. What about afterward? Justin asked. If Catherine dies, Samantha's going to be devastated. She'll lean on me for support, which gives me more access to her life, but there's also that aunt. Helen. She's paranoid and suspicious of everything. If Catherine dies, Helen's going to start asking questions. Let her ask, Richard said dismissively. Nobody takes Helen Vaughn seriously. She's been crying wolf about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Catherine's death wasn't an accident, people will just think she's being paranoid again. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. We clean up thoroughly, make sure the accident investigation is handled by people we can trust, and move on. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing logistics and contingencies, discussing my mother's murder with the same tone people use when planning a vacation or organizing a work project. When it finally ended, I sat in the silence of Helen's underground archive, trying to process what I'd just heard. Justin hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been a plant from the beginning, positioned in my life specifically to monitor my mother's investigation into Meridian Pharmaceuticals. He'd courted me, proposed to me, married me, all as part of a strategy to gain access to information that might threaten a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme. And when using me didn't work, when my mother kept her investigation separate from her family life, they'd killed her and made it look like an accident on a rainy night. I found more tapes. Conversations between Natalie and someone named Dr. Sarah Chin, apparently Natalie's aunt and a senior researcher at Meridian. These recordings revealed that Natalie had been assigned to befriend me after my mother's death, to make sure I remained isolated and manageable, to monitor whether I showed any signs of investigating what had really happened. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every heart-to-heart conversation had been data collection. Our entire friendship had been fabricated. I don't know how long I sat in that crawl space listening to recordings, reading documents, piecing together the full scope of what had been done to my mother and to me. Hours maybe. Long enough that my back ached from sitting on the concrete floor and my eyes burned from reading in the LED light. Finally, I found the laptop Helen had left. It was plugged into a power strip, its battery showing fully charged. A note attached to the screen said, "Play this first," with an arrow pointing to a video file on the desktop labeled "For Samantha." I opened the file and Helen's face filled the screen. She looked exactly like I remembered from the last time I'd seen her at a family holiday 2 years ago, though visibly ill. Her face was drawn, her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the camera, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She wore a cardigan I recognized, navy blue with wooden buttons, the same one she'd worn to every family gathering for the past decade. "Samantha," she began, her voice steady despite the physical deterioration visible in her face. "If you're watching this, it means I'm dead and you found my archive. Which means you're probably angry and confused and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive." She paused to take a sip of water from a bottle sitting just off camera. "The answer is that I tried. I warned you about Justin at your engagement party. I pulled you aside and told you to be careful, that something about him felt wrong. I told you to watch how Natalie behaved around him, to pay attention to the small things that didn't quite add up. You thought I was being paranoid. You said I saw conspiracies everywhere and needed to let you live your own life without interference." Helen's expression softened slightly. "And I don't blame you for that. I'd spent decades being the family member everyone described as difficult and eccentric. The one who handed out pamphlets about corporate corruption at Thanksgiving. The one who warned about trusting people with perfect smiles and convenient explanations. By the time I tried to warn you about Justin, you'd already learned to dismiss everything I said as paranoia." She adjusted the camera angle slightly, leaning forward. "Your mother Catherine was my best friend long before she was your mother. We grew up protecting each other, and when she discovered what Meridian was doing, she came to me first because she knew I would help her document everything properly. We spent months building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to go to federal authorities. Then she died in that convenient accident, and I knew exactly what had happened even though I couldn't prove it yet." Helen coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. When she pulled it away, I could see blood on the white fabric. "I've spent the last 6 years of my life collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. Every document, every recording, every financial trail. I did it because I loved your mother and because I love you. Because I couldn't let them get away with killing Catherine and destroying your life without any consequences." She looked directly at the camera with an intensity that made it feel like she was in the room with me. "You have 2 choices, Samantha. Just like your mother had 2 choices before they killed her. You can take the money I left you and disappear. Change your identity, move somewhere far away, live comfortably and safely and never look back. Nobody would blame you for choosing survival over justice. You've already lost so much. You deserve peace if that's what you want." Helen coughed again, harder this time, and had to pause for a long moment before continuing. "Or you can fight. You can use everything I've collected and burn these people down. Expose Meridian, expose Justin and Natalie and everyone who participated in your mother's murder and your destruction. It won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You'll be threatened. You'll be harassed. You might be in danger. But Samantha, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them pay a price for what they did." She smiled then, that crooked smile I remembered from childhood when she'd sneak me extra cookies or let me stay up past my bedtime reading in her library. "Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you no matter what you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night." Helen's expression became serious again. "I love you, Samantha. Don't let them win." She reached for something off camera, then looked back at the screen. "Oh, and there's one more thing I haven't mentioned in the written materials. Mountain Pacific Credit Union, account number 7743. Password is your mother's employee number from Meridian. That's the real fortune. The $70,000 in the suitcase is just travel money. Use what's in that account to fight or use it to run, but for God's sake, use it." The video ended with Helen reaching toward the camera, and then the screen went black. I sat staring at the blank screen for a long time before I pulled out my phone and searched for Mountain Pacific Credit Union's phone number. The call to Mountain Pacific Credit Union took 45 minutes of navigating automated menus before I finally reached a human being. I gave them the account number Helen had mentioned, and the representative went quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Ma'am," she said finally, her voice suddenly much more professional. I'm going to need to transfer you to our wealth management division. Please hold. The hold music was classical piano that sounded like it was being played underwater. After what felt like an eternity, a woman named Patricia came on the line and asked me to verify my identity using my mother's employee number as the password. When I gave her the numbers, she paused for a moment before explaining in careful language that Helen had established a trust in my name. The trust contains stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights that your mother secured before her death, Patricia said. The total value is approximately $14 million, structured to protect it from legal challenges and ensure that only you can access it. $14 million. The words didn't sound real. They sounded like dialogue from a movie about someone else's life, not mine. I was sitting in a dead woman's underground archive, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and murder, and now being told that I had access to more money than I could properly comprehend. Helen had spent 6 years not just collecting evidence but building a financial foundation that would allow me to fight without being destroyed by legal fees and endless court battles. She'd wrapped justice like a gift and left it with enough resources to actually achieve it. I chose to fight. Using the contact information Helen had left in her files, I called Agent Maria Torres at the FBI's Portland field office. She answered on the third ring with a tone that suggested she was busy and didn't have time for whatever I was calling about. "This is Torres. My name is Samantha Garrett," I said, hearing my own voice shake slightly. "My Aunt Helen Vaughn left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build. About Meridian Pharmaceuticals." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Where are you right now?" Maria asked, her tone completely changed. "Lake Oswego. At my aunt's property. Don't leave. I'm coming to you. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't touch anything else and whatever Helen left you, just wait for me. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. Maria arrived in 35 minutes, which suggested she'd driven faster than was probably legal. She was in her late 40s, with gray streaking through dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a blazer with an FBI badge clipped to her belt. She looked at me standing in Helen's overgrown backyard with an expression that was part skepticism and part hope. "Show me," she said. I led her to the shed, down the ladder into the underground archive, and watched her face change as she took in the filing cabinets, the boxes, the organized documentation of 6 years of investigation. She put on latex gloves before touching anything, pulling out files and reading with an intensity that made me understand why Helen had trusted her. "Your aunt was either the most thorough investigator I've ever encountered or she was completely brilliant," Maria said after about 20 minutes of reviewing documents. "Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy charges, fraud, possibly murder if we can prove the car accident was arranged. Samantha, you just handed me a case that could take down a major pharmaceutical company." The investigation that followed moved with bureaucratic slowness that Maria assured me was normal when building cases against corporations with billions in assets and armies of lawyers. Subpoenas had to be drafted, reviewed, approved by judges. Bank records needed freezing, which required warrants, which required probable cause, which required more paperwork than I'd thought existed. Former Meridian employees who'd been fired or quit under suspicious circumstances were interviewed. The pharmaceutical industry's informal network of whistleblowers started emerging, sharing their own stories of fraud and retaliation. Maria helped me find a small apartment in Portland, a one-bedroom in an old building with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that rattled whenever trains passed on the tracks 2 blocks away. It was infinitely better than room 14 at the Crossroads Motel, but I kept it modest because I didn't want to feel like I was spending resources that should be reserved for the legal battle ahead. I used money from Helen's trust to pay rent and buy groceries, living simply while the investigation churned forward. I met with prosecutors every few weeks. They had detailed questions about every piece of evidence Helen had collected, asking me to explain timelines and relationships and conversations I'd overheard years ago that I hadn't understood were significant at the time. They wanted to know about Justin's schedule, about Natalie's visits, about my mother's behavior in the months before she died. I answered everything as thoroughly as I could, watching them take notes and exchange glances that suggested they were building something substantial. Maria called periodically with updates that mostly consisted of "we're making progress and don't talk to anyone about this." It was what federal agents say when they can't share details but want you to know you haven't been forgotten. The waiting was harder than anything that had come before. I'd handed over everything Helen had collected, and now I was just existing in limbo, hoping that the machinery of justice would actually work for once instead of grinding up innocent people and spitting them out as statistics. For months after I'd first met Maria in Helen's underground archive, things started happening with the kind of speed that suggested the government had finally accumulated enough evidence to move forward confidently. It began on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Meridian Pharmaceuticals headquarters got raided by federal agents who carried boxes out of a gleaming glass building that looked like a monument to corporate success. The images made national news, showing employees standing in the parking lot looking confused and scared while agents in FBI windbreakers methodically dismantled what had seemed like an untouchable empire. Richard Moss, the CEO whose voice I'd heard on Helen's recordings discussing my mother's murder like it was a minor inconvenience, was arrested at his home. News cameras caught footage of him being led out in handcuffs past his neighbors, past reporters shouting questions he didn't answer, past a life that had been built on fraud and was now collapsing in real time. Maria called me that afternoon to tell me Justin had been arrested at his office at a tech startup where he'd been working since the divorce. I watched the footage on the local news that evening, rewinding it multiple times because apparently I'd developed unhealthy coping mechanisms around witnessing karma manifest in handcuffs and perp walks. Justin maintained his composure, didn't speak to reporters, walked with his head up like he was enduring a minor inconvenience rather than being arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. But I could see something in his eyes that looked like fear mixed with disbelief, like he genuinely thought he was untouchable and was only now realizing how wrong he'd been. Natalie was arrested 2 days later at a coffee shop in Seattle where she'd apparently moved after the divorce. She'd used her Meridian payments to fund a graphic design business that was actually legitimate this time, and according to the news reports, she cried during her arrest. The tears felt performative to me, given that she'd testified against me in divorce court without showing a single genuine emotion. Her attorney issued a statement claiming she'd been manipulated by Justin and had no idea about the extent of the conspiracy, that she was a victim herself who'd been taken advantage of by more powerful people. But I'd heard the recordings of her conversations with Dr. Sarah Chin. I'd read the documents showing payments made specifically to maintain her friendship with me as a monitoring operation. Natalie hadn't been a victim. She'd been a willing participant who'd cultivated our friendship deliberately to ensure I remained isolated and manageable after my mother's death. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every conversation where she'd encouraged me to trust Justin, to ignore my instincts, to believe that my marriage problems were normal had been calculated manipulation. The betrayal from Natalie cut deeper than Justin's in some ways. I'd chosen to marry Justin, but Natalie had been assigned to me without my knowledge or consent. Our entire friendship had been fabricated from the beginning. Then came the news about Judge Robert Cunningham. He resigned from the bench with a statement about wanting to spend more time with family, which is what corrupt officials say when they're hoping resignation will prevent criminal prosecution. It didn't work. He was indicted 3 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Documents Helen had collected showed he'd purchased a vacation home through a trust that traced back to Meridian, that he'd been ruling in favor of corporate interests for years in exchange for payments disguised as consulting fees. Every case he'd presided over in the last decade was reviewed. My divorce case was among the first, and a new judge took 15 minutes to determine that the original ruling had been based on fabricated testimony and biased proceedings. Everything Cunningham had decided was vacated, erased like it had never happened. Maria called me the day the review of my case was completed. "Your marriage to Justin is being annulled rather than finalized as a divorce," she said. "The court's declaring it invalid from the beginning due to fraud. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system for whatever that's worth." It was worth something. Not enough to undo the damage or erase the months of suffering, but something. The formal apology from the judicial system arrived as a letter on official court stationery, signed by 3 judges including the one who'd reviewed my case. It acknowledged that I'd been subjected to proceedings that were fundamentally compromised by corruption and fabricated testimony. It expressed regret for the harm caused by a system that had failed to protect me from coordinated fraud. It was 2 pages of careful legal language that tried to convey remorse without admitting liability in a way that might open the courts to further lawsuits. I read it once and filed it away with all the other documents that marked the destruction and slow rebuilding of my life. The apology didn't undo the months I'd spent sleeping on couches and in motel rooms. It didn't erase the trauma of watching my best friend testify against me with lies or the humiliation of losing everything because a judge had been bought. But it was acknowledgement. Official recognition that what had been done to me was wrong. The trials began 6 months after the arrests and stretched across a year and a half. Maria had warned me that cases this complex moved slowly, that building prosecutions against multiple defendants with interconnected criminal activity required patience and meticulous attention to procedural detail. He was right. The legal process ground forward with the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that makes glaciers look fast by comparison. Richard Moss went to trial first. His case became a media spectacle that dominated news cycles for weeks. Pharmaceutical industry whistleblowers testified about the culture of fraud at Meridian, describing how executives incentivized researchers to manipulate trial data and how safety concerns were systematically buried when they threatened profitable drug approvals. Patients who'd been harmed by medications that should never have reached the market shared their stories. A woman whose daughter had died from complications related to a drug Meridian had rushed through approval with falsified safety data spoke for 20 minutes about watching her child suffer. Forensic accountants explained money trails that connected executive bonuses directly to fraudulent approvals, showing how Richard Moss had personally profited from every dangerous medication the company brought to market. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned with guilty verdicts on 17 counts including fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and reckless endangerment, Richard Moss showed no visible emotion. He stood while the judge read the sentence. 23 years in federal prison and forfeiture of approximately $40 million in assets. He was 62 years old, which meant he'd likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. I watched the sentencing from the gallery, sitting in the back row where I could observe without being noticed. When the judge finished reading the sentence and the bailiffs led Richard Moss away in handcuffs, I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite closure. It was more like watching a long mathematical equation finally balance, all the variables falling into their proper places after years of deliberate miscalculation. Justin's trial was smaller and quieter, without the media attention that had surrounded Richard Moss. But it was more personal for me. I attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the same seat in the back row, watching prosecutors present evidence of his role in monitoring my mother, his participation in planning her murder, his 7-year marriage to me as an extended intelligence-gathering operation. The recordings Helen had collected were played in court. I listened to Justin's voice discussing my mother like she was an obstacle that needed removing, heard him report on conversations I'd had about her work, heard him strategize about how to use our relationship for information gathering. The prosecutors presented bank records showing payments made to him throughout our marriage, demonstrating that he'd been compensated for every month he'd spent pretending to love me. His defense attorney tried to argue that Justin had been a low-level participant manipulated by more powerful people, that he'd been coerced into involvement he hadn't fully understood. But the recordings showed someone who'd been enthusiastic and willing, who'd made strategic suggestions about how to approach my mother's murder, who'd continued receiving payments and participating in the conspiracy years after her death. The jury returned guilty verdicts on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Justin looked at me across the courtroom. His expression was complicated, something between anger and resignation, as if he couldn't quite believe that the woman he'd married as part of a surveillance operation had been the one to bring evidence that destroyed him. I looked back without blinking, without emotion, because I was done being intimidated by people who'd systematically underestimated what I was capable of when pushed far enough. Natalie accepted a plea deal rather than going to trial. In exchange for testimony against other defendants, her sentence was reduced to 8 years. She provided information about Dr. Sarah Chin and other Meridian employees who'd been part of the conspiracy, helping prosecutors build cases against people who might otherwise have escaped accountability. 6 months after her sentencing, I received a letter from her. 3 pages written on prison stationery, full of apologies and explanations about how she'd been young and desperate for money when Meridian first approached her. How she'd made terrible choices she regretted every day. How being assigned to befriend me had started as just a job but had become complicated when she'd actually grown to care about me despite the lies. She asked if we could eventually find a way to forgive each other and move forward, because our friendship had meant something real even though it was built on deception. I read the letter once while sitting in my Portland apartment with morning coffee, and I felt nothing but a hollow kind of satisfaction. The letter was self-justification dressed up in the language of remorse, trying to rewrite history so that Natalie could see herself as a victim of circumstances rather than an active participant in destroying another person's life. She wanted absolution I wasn't willing to give. I filed the letter away in a folder with other evidence of betrayal and never responded. Some relationships can't be repaired and shouldn't be attempted. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroyed your life just because they later regret getting caught. The civil lawsuit against Meridian Pharmaceuticals took another 2 years to resolve. The company fought aggressively, deploying teams of lawyers to challenge every claim and drag out proceedings as long as possible. But eventually, facing the weight of evidence that had already resulted in criminal convictions for their executives, they settled. The terms required Meridian to pay $2.7 billion to patients who'd been harmed by their fraudulent drug approvals. They had to fund independent safety reviews of every medication they'd brought to market in the past decade. They were placed under federal monitoring for 15 years, with regulators embedded in their approval processes to prevent future fraud. My mother's estate received $12 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it as her only living relative, and I donated every dollar to organizations that advocate for pharmaceutical safety and transparency. The money felt tainted, earned through my mother's murder, and I already had enough resources from Helen's trust to live comfortably without it. Instead, I used part of Helen's trust to start the Vaughn Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating pharmaceutical fraud and supporting whistleblowers who risk their careers to expose corporate misconduct. We hired investigators to track down evidence of safety violations. We funded legal defenses for employees facing retaliation after reporting problems. We published reports that made pharmaceutical companies uncomfortable, shining light into corners where they preferred darkness. The foundation became my full-time work. My way of channeling grief and anger into something productive, something that would have made my mother and Helen proud. Something that turned their deaths into a legacy that actually helped people instead of just being tragic endings to lives cut short by greed. I still think about room 14 at the Crossroads Motel sometimes. About sitting on that sagging bed eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole my life had become. I keep the receipt from my last week there in my wallet as a reminder that rock bottom is real, that humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you, but they can't actually destroy you unless you let them. Helen had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case and assembling resources because she believed truth mattered more than comfort and justice mattered more than safety. She'd been right. The paranoid aunt everyone dismissed had been the only one who understood how the world actually worked, who recognized that powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them or play by rules they ignore. The final truth Helen left me proved prophetic in ways I'm still discovering. Fighting doesn't always lead to winning, but not fighting guarantees losing. I built a meaningful life from the ruins of a fraudulent one. Messy and complicated and fundamentally honest. The kind of ending my mother and Helen would have appreciated. The kind of story that reminds people that patience and documentation can topple empires built on lies, and that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply refusing to let corrupt people erase you from the narrative they've constructed around their own importance. I'm not the woman I was when I found that suitcase under the motel bed. I'm stronger than she was. More careful about trust but also more certain about what matters. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. I'm grateful I'm not her anymore. If this story of justice and resilience kept you captivated until the very end, show your support by hitting that like button right now. My favorite part was when Samantha discovered Helen's underground archive and realized her paranoid aunt had been right about everything all along. What was your favorite moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of truth and redemption like this one. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're notified the instant we upload.